Welcome. I'm Andreas Wittmer, Director of Entrepreneurship Programs in the New School of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America. Our next speaker for the conference Liberty and Solidarity, Living the Vocation to Business is Frank Hanna. Mr. Hanna is CEO of Hanna Capital in Atlanta, Georgia. He invests as a merchant banker in technology and financial services, and he has started and sold a number of businesses over the last 25 years. He has often spoken on philanthropy and has written a best-selling book called What Your Money Means. Mr. Hanna is the founder of the Solidarity Association, which safeguards the oldest copy of the Gospel of Luke and also the oldest copy of the Lord's Prayer in the Vatican Library. Mr. Hanna will focus here on the question, how does the practice of solidarity in business strengthen human relationships and promote human flourishing?
Good morning, and thanks for having me speak to you today. It's great to be with so many good friends. And you may think after you start hearing me speak that the three of us, Mary and Catherine, and I got together last week and sort of figured out what themes we wanted to talk about. I hope it all, but that doesn't hold them responsible for what I'm about to say, because they may disagree with some of it. But Dana Bella asked that I speak to you today regarding how does the practice of solidarity in business strengthen human relationships and promote human flourishing? Well, assuming that you believe, as I do, that solidarity is a good thing, it's almost axiomatic that the practice of such solidarity, whether in business or for that matter anywhere else, would indeed result in the strengthening of human relationships and the promotion of human flourishing. I think we all accept that conclusion as a foundational premise. So maybe the truly provocative question for us today is, first, what dynamics within the modern business world might encourage us to practice solidarity? And secondly, how might those opportunities be exploited most effectively? By the way, I think conferences like this should be provocative. I think they should provoke new and challenging thinking about significant issues. Now, of course, they should provoke us toward the truth. But if we're not truly opening our minds toward fresh perspectives, we're just kind of repeating already accepted articles of faith. Now, that's a good thing, not a bad thing, but I don't know if it's the best use of a conference like this. I think we need to be provocative. So if I provoke you in a bad way, you can get me at the break and disagree with me and challenge me. Let's start by exploring the dynamics of the modern business world that might present opportunities for practicing solidarity. And let's start that process by acknowledging certain realities of that business world. First, no one really escapes the modern business world, nor should they want to. The modern business world is nothing more than the market. And an authority no less than Pope Benedict told us that markets are to be valued, for they are a place where human beings encounter one another. Markets, the business world, are a place where people voluntarily trade with one another to the betterment of both parties. One may or may not act with virtue, either in the marketplace or in the temple. But assuming one acts with virtue, and granted, that's a big assumption, but assuming one acts with virtue in the market, he leaves the market having increased his wealth and having increased the wealth of the person with whom he's traded. A free market, when engaged in by people acting in a virtuous manner, is a place where everyone who trades becomes wealthier. Now, I know that last statement may shock you, and you may at first disagree with it. It may take you aback. You may be thinking, there's no way that everyone who trades becomes wealthier. But you'd be thinking that way because you'd be trapped in materialism. You'd be defining wealth in a narrow, materialistic manner rather than in the way it ought to be defined. You see, wealth is not merely money. There's a reason that Mary spoke of material wealth. That's a form of wealth. It's not merely money. The root of the word wealth comes from the Old English word weal, meaning well-being. assuming that a market is free, in other words, there's no coercion, and assuming the participants are acting in a virtuous manner, rather than, for example, negotiating for something like prostitution that's inherently sinful, assuming that it's neither coercive and that people are acting in a virtuous manner, both participants to a trade in the market leave the market with a greater degree of well-being, a greater amount of wealth than they had prior to entering the market. So stated again, a free market, when engaged in by people acting in a virtuous manner, is a place where everyone who trades becomes wealthier. Now, future events may come about in which the participants in any particular trade regret their trade. For example, I may buy a share of stock. I only buy that share if I believe it is worth more than the money I'm paying to buy it. So right after the trade, I believe my wealth to have been marginally increased. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it. Now, if the price of the stock later goes down, my well-being may decrease, but it won't be because of the trade I made in the market. It's because of some future event that now occurs. All kinds of good and bad things may happen in the future over which I have no control, any of which may increase or decrease my well-being. If I catch a cold on the plane on the way back home, my well-being, my wealth, will suffer diminution, but not because I bought the plane ticket. I said earlier that no one really escapes the modern business world. I'm sure all of you are aware that after doing a thorough examination of the IOR, commonly known as the Vatican Bank, Pope Francis has decided not to close it down, but rather to keep it in operation. Whether he stated the conclusion in this way or not, I believe the Vatican Bank is staying open because of the belief that it enhances the well-being, the wealth of those with whom it does business. So why make this point? Well, I think when we ask a question like how the practice of solidarity in business can strengthen human relationships and promote human flourishing, we're close to when we ask that question, we're close to perpetuating the stereotype that the business world is somehow this necessary evil against which we must guard ourselves. Instead, the business world is to be embraced as something whose very raison d'etre is to increase the wealth of everyone who enters into it, as something that is, in fact, a gift from God. The thing to be guarded against in the business world and everywhere else is sin. Before I ever entered the business world, as a child, I had encountered betrayal, greed, selfishness, materialism, cheating, narcissism, rudeness, stealing, cowardice, and lying. The only really new thing I learned about these sins when I got to the business world is that they weren't limited to children. And I also knew they weren't an inherent feature of the market because I'd already encountered all of them on the playground. Fine then, let's acknowledge for the moment that the business world is a good thing, that many of us are smack dab in it, and that none of us really avoid it. How do we practice solidarity within it so as to strengthen human relationships? Well, one of the cool things about the business world is that it's focused on returns on investment. It measures them with mathematical order, much as was done by our greatest teacher, who spoke of talents being invested to yield more talents, and who, when speaking of the seed that fell to the ground and referred to the seed on good soil, referenced a yield of 30, 60, and 100-fold. So too should we imitate our Lord and seek such returns. And this gets to the part of the effort where we as evangelizers and as members of the body of Christ, we must herald our discovery. And that discovery is this: nothing creates more wealth, more well-being than human flourishing and than human relationships. Pope Benedict, just a few years before he stepped down from the papacy, spoke to a group of leading businessmen. And he told them that human relationships, this was right when the global crisis, financial crisis was happening. And he said human relationships ought to be the constituent element of their lives. The challenge is that it's hard to measure the quality of our human relationships, which is the source of our greatest well-being. So we rely on a shortcut. for our wealth. We measure our well-being, our wealth, in dollars. Now, dollars aren't irrelevant. In fact, they're often quite relevant. But they're a very, very poor proxy for real wealth. But again, this is where the challenge for the Christian business person comes about. He or she must not neglect the dollars, but must in the end actually conduct himself as if something else has priority. You see, this issue of being a Christian in the business world is not a constant Manichaean choice between having money or being good. It's rather a matter of priorities. Do we put first things first? The way to practice solidarity in business, such that human relationships are strengthened and human flourishing abounds, is to make such solidarity the higher priority. It's not in place of profits, but it's more important. So I want to make a suggestion for strengthening those human relationships, which might strike against so much of what you may think makes you an American, if you are an American. For those of you who are not American, you won't find this as instinctively troubling. What I want to suggest is that if we want to strengthen our human relationships, which is the most important factor to the flourishing of all humanity, if we want to do that, then we should decrease our independence and increase our dependence. Now, this may strike against so much of what you believe it is to be an American. Let's face it, our country got started with a declaration of independence. But you know what? That document was arguably misnamed. Most of the colonists did not actually want independence. They just wanted to be free from tyranny and injustice. That's very different from wanting to be independent. We may say we want our children to be independent, but do we really? I mean, what do we even mean by that? That we don't want them to need us? My father and mother are approaching the end of their lives. I still need them. My father and I would have a hard time working together daily, but we go to lunch all the time, and we share thoughts and time and ideas and friendship and love. I'm not independent of him. And in fact, I'm quite dependent. Now, as Christians, we know we're never to be independent of our Father in heaven. In fact, we're to cultivate our dependence, even to the point of deepening and increasing that dependence on a daily basis. In the best marriages, the spouses actually increase their dependence on one another. This phenomenon is actually quite reasonable, even though it may at first seem counterintuitive. The reality is that human relationships are strengthened when the humans involved are dependent rather than independent of one another. The business partnerships that prevail are the ones where both partners need one another. Now, some of the most financially successful companies in the world understand at least one dimension of this phenomena. They desperately want you, their customer, to be dependent on their product or service. They know with a fair degree of mathematical precision that the more dependent you are on them, the more profitable is the relationship for them. But here are two additional aspects of this phenomena which might seem equally counterintuitive to you. First, if your dependence on a particular good or service is very profitable for that company, they're pretty dependent on you too. So Google trades at a multiple of 30 times their earnings. They trade at that multiple because many people are dependent on their search engine and go to it first. But Google's equally dependent on the relationship with its customers. If it fails to deliver good value, it'll no longer be the first choice as a search engine, and its multiple will go down to around 10 times. And the company will be worth $300 billion less than it is today. You see, Google's dependence on us is pretty significant too. Now, the second additional counterintuitive aspect of this phenomena is that if you're dependent on someone else, the level of your dependence on them is probably correlated to the amount of additional wealth that's created by that dependency. Let me give you an example. How many of us have now become dependent on our cell phones. You don't even need to raise your hand. I know it's almost everyone. Okay. Why is that? Well, because it brings so much value to you. I know they're a pain and they're a distraction, but we carry them because they enhance our well-being, our wealth. If it doesn't enhance your well-being, don't complain about it, throw it away. Your dependence on this product means that purchasing it has been profitable for you and for the company that made it. As I mentioned earlier, some of the most successful companies realize the value of creating these dependencies. Many cultures have some version of the saying, of the maxim, the customer is king. The best businesses herald their dependence on their customers and their gratitude for that dependence. Because here's what they also know. If they're constantly cognizant of their dependence on their customers, they are more likely to create the kind of value for that customer such that the customer becomes dependent on them. And guess what? That's a really good thing. Think of a deep, long-lasting friendship. In such a friendship, there's a mutuality of dependence. The friends are, to use the pejorative psychological term, codependents. And they love and value that friendship. So how can we cultivate more of that dependence in our business and in our lives so we strengthen our human relationships and promote human flourishing? I want to close today by covering the 5 steps I think we can take to accentuate our focus on cultivating dependence with one another. First, we must continually be refining and redefining our notion of wealth. At a panel earlier this summer, I surprised Dana Bella and I asked him if he could give us different ways that wealth is created in different countries and various alternatives. We're looking at various alternatives. The world's looking at it because they know that GDP, gross domestic product, is not really an adequate way to measure wealth. It measures income, but not wealth. We all know a stream of income that's received for 20 years is worth a lot more than a stream of income that's received for 5 years. Even discounting it, for those of you who are in finance, even discounting it at 5%, the stream for 20 years is worth 3 times the stream for 5 years. In other words, when I talk about these dividends that you get for 20 years versus 5 years, okay, long-term profitable relationships are worth a lot more than short-term relationships. Cardinal Ratzinger, in his last homily before the conclave in which he became Pope Benedict, said that of all the things in the world, mountains, bridges, rivers, art, buildings, books, the only thing that lasts into eternity is the human soul. And if we want to invest in the best payoff for our wealth, the thing that pays dividends forever, right? We have to invest in the human soul and human relationships. We all know intuitively that healthy long-term relationships make life richer. But you know, someone actually won the Nobel Prize in economics by demonstrating the mathematical proof of this conclusion. Ronald Coase wrote about why people form firms and partnerships in business, noting mathematically that the transaction cost of having to negotiate anew for every new endeavor that you did would at times be so great that it would be better for individuals to band together, even if such banding together might lead to suboptimal economic conditions in certain situations. Because in the real world, they'd find it easier to work together over the long run, and they'd end up with having their productivity yield a much greater result. Now, we don't need to go into all the math of his equation that won him the Nobel Prize, but suffice it to say, when my brother and I sit down together to talk through a business problem, the fact that we've been doing this together for the last 25 years, it now makes our discussion not only easy, but actually pleasant. We've benefited so much from this phenomenon, and now we emphasize to our potential business partners that we're seeking long-term relationships that can last upwards of 20 years or more. The second step we must take to cultivate our dependence on one another is to focus on value creation. These days, I'm of the age that a lot of my friends ask me to meet with their college kids who are graduating, and the kid wants to come in and talk about some of y'all are back there, talk about their career and everything. So we talk about business and their career, and among other things, which is they need to start looking for a spouse, I tell them about value creation. No matter what field they might be entering into, they need to constantly be focused on creating value for other people. I tell them, you see, if you bring value to others, they'll depend on you, and that will further your career. If you do that, it will make you wealthy. There are 5 ways you can make money. You can get it as a gift, you can steal it, you can gamble, you can swindle, which is another way of stealing in the market, or you can deliver value and be paid for that value. Only 2 of those are legitimate, and we don't want to depend on somebody giving us money. And so the last way, the delivery of value, is that on which we need to focus our business energy. The cool thing about delivering value is how other-directed it is. In order to deliver value to someone else, we simply must put aside our selfish desires and focus on the needs of someone else. I love the first line of Rick Warren's best-selling book, The Purpose-Driven Life. The first line of that book reads, "It's not about you." If we want to practice solidarity by strengthening human relationships, we have to first realize it's not all about us. And a great method of doing that in business, and for that matter in the rest of life too, is to think about this question of how I might deliver value to someone else. The third way to strengthening human relationships and promoting human flourishing in our businesses is to practice it in our own homes. What better training? Our businesses should not be regarded as more important than the rest of our lives, nor is all that different. I'm involved in a lot of public policy issues, and I often have folks approach me because they know I'm engaged in these things and come up to Washington and meet with people. They come to me with ideas about how to save the church or how to save the world. And I tell them, maybe before saving the world, we ought to save our own country. But maybe before saving our own country, we ought to save our own state. But maybe before saving our own state, we ought to save our own city. But maybe before saving our own city, we ought to save our own workplace or our own parish. And what I hear back is, "Oh, Frank, you don't understand. My pastor would never listen to me about any new ideas at my parish." And I think to myself, so you think it's too hard to make your parish better, but you've got ideas about how we're going to save the world, okay? And that really does happen. It's hard to fix your family or your parish or your workplace. It's better to say what Congress should do. But you know what? Even before saving our parishes or workplace, we have to ask, are we saving our own families? In other words, if we're not strengthening the human relationships we have at home and promoting human flourishing there, everything else we do is a clanging gong or a clashing cymbal because we've neglected the most important part. The fourth step, we must understand that solidarity and human relationships require time and presence. So how do we cultivate time and presence? By staying still and silent. We know this spiritually. We know that in order to have time and presence with the Lord, we have to be still and silent. But you know what most of us do? We do violence to this notion of being still. About a year ago, Pope Francis spoke about airport bishops who travel around the world but do not know the smell of their sheep. But he could also be speaking to many of us who aren't bishops and priests. He could be speaking to many of us lay people. We do violence to our geographical peace. Now, please understand, I'm not condemning air travel. I do it every week, okay? But we have to be aware of its hazards. We must seek to govern it. Otherwise, it can lead to escapism. I know that for many people in business, it's a form of escapism, even though they may not want to admit it. The same thing can happen with our children. We send them away from their families and their homes for schooling as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I'm not seeking to condemn those who make geographic moves, but we have to consider the human cost in relationships when we send our best and brightest away from their homes. Does it promote solidarity? And if not, then what do we need to do to counterbalance that? You know, the church doesn't speak to this issue of modern mobility very much. Many priests and bishops have moved far away from their families, and they have sympathy, which is right, for those who have to move for educational or economic opportunity. And there are many wonderful things that have happened because of mobility. But there's a price. There's a price in terms of solidarity. We will not have solidarity in our society if we don't have it in our neighborhoods and in our parishes and in our workplace. And if the turnover of people moving in and out all the time and being gone all the time, if that turnover in each of these specific geographic locations, including our businesses and our neighborhoods, if that turnover passes a tipping point, each of those places becomes more like a train station or an airport rather than a home or a neighborhood or a workplace. And we all know there's not a lot of solidarity and human flourishing in airports. And so can we be surprised when corporations and employees don't feel loyalty to one another when they've not developed solidarity within their own communities? And finally, the fifth step, and then I'll close. And it's related to the previous suggestion. If we're to strengthen our human relationships and promote human flourishing, we must live with the smell of our sheep. This phrase has become one of the best known lessons of Pope Francis. He directed it at priests and bishops, but it's true for many of us, any of us, in a position of leadership. For as leaders, we're to be shepherds. We're to live with the smell of our sheep. You know, there have been some recent studies about baby smell. And you know the wonderful smell of a baby. My 14-month-old grandson has like a hint of vanilla in his little baby smell. One study showed that when given 3 different hospital gowns, and they could just smell them, okay, 80% of all mothers pick their baby's hospital gown, okay? That smell's really important. They know the smell of their sheep. That's how we have to be in our businesses. That's one of the things we have to do to promote human relationships and human flourishing. We have to know the smell of our sheep. Our customers, the best businesses know the smell of their customers. We must know our employees and our coworkers. But first, we have to know our own families. We must understand ourselves to be shepherds caring for our sheep. And this goes for all of us, no matter what station in life we might find ourselves. You know, everyone has a lamb to take care of. I took my grandson to his first football game on Saturday. He's 14 months, but he hung in there, okay? He has someone to take care of, because when he grins at me, he takes care of me. And I hold him close, and I call him Angel Boy, and I whisper it in his ear, and I smell his skin and his hair, and I take care of him, and we're both wealthier, for we're dependent on one another. My dear friends, if we want to practice solidarity within business and strengthen human relationships and promote human flourishing, we must seek and cultivate dependence, first on God, and then among our family members, our coworkers, and our customers. Thanks very much.
Our next speaker is Edward Hadas. Mr. Hadas is economics editor at Reuters Breakingviews and a columnist at Reuters.com. He also teaches political and social philosophy at the Merivale Institute in Birmingham, England. Before becoming a journalist, he worked for 25 years as a financial analyst for various firms, including Morgan Stanley and Putnam Investments. He will now speak on the question, how can firms have solidarity with the poor?
Now, everyone is potentially someone we know. We're connected to roughly 2/3 of the world by mobile phone, by roughly half the world and growing fast by internet. By travel, we can get to any of these people pretty much in a day or two, most of them in a day. These people, and in our economy, there's a great global interaction. So that shirt that was being discussed this morning, the shirt that I'm actually buying, that I buy for an hour of my labor, has come from all over the world. The cotton from one place, the sewing from another, the factory, the oil that took the ship from the factory. There are probably 20 countries, probably thousands and thousands of miles away, halfway around the world, that have brought that shirt to me. I have a solidarity in that product with the people who made it, but I don't know those people. I don't know of them, and unless I make an effort, I'm not going to be able to actually care about them. But I'm already tied to them in my economic relationship. I buy the shirt that they've helped to produce or helped to bring to me. And I should, as a human person, and as a person capable of relationship, translate that solidarity, that economic unity, into a personal unity of charity. So I have and of all the people that I should have that solidarity with, the ones who are most crying out to heaven, most crying out in need for my care, are indeed the poorest people, those who are most lost in this world, least access to the goods that God gives us in the natural world and in the human world. Those are the ones whom I should search out the most. So there is a preferential option for the poor that calls us, to each of us, and each of us in our business lives, to try to become closer to these people, this least of our brothers, whoever they may be. Now, of course, much of that kind of solidarity on a social scale is not really the matter for business. We worry about things like immigration or trade rules or wage laws or education or charitable organizations that are explicitly not for business but just to give things to share our wealth in one way or another. We may worry about transport or housing or some other kind of issue that's not directly a business issue. And as citizens or as members of the acting community, we should be concerned about these things. But Andrew Abella asked me specifically to think about this from the point of view of the firm. And I think it's worth thinking about because particularly the very narrow definition of corporate purpose that economists have developed and that is sort of half enshrined in law, that the purpose of a company is not the flourishing of the good, not the contribution to some common good, not even the good of the community which this company serves, but an extremely narrow notion of profitability, a return for one part of the community, the equity investors, that's supposed to be not satisfying, but in fact maximizing. Pretty much everything is wrong with that definition in terms of thinking about how any organization can fit well and into a strong solidaristic society. An organization should not be aiming at such a narrow objective, such a financial objective, such an objective that doesn't really include the depth and breadth of purpose that humans have. And corporations are, after all, made up ultimately of humans, their goods, their relationship to the natural world is encompassed in that. So this sort of profit-seeking, narrow profit-seeking corporation is just a bad way of looking at it. And if we want to talk about solidarity, we're going to have to think about the company, the firm, in a broader, deeper way than just a profit-seeking sort of marriage of convenience of different people, a property right sort of thing. And I think it's really important to think about this because probably most of the people in this room would be very unhappy if solidarity, such as it is, or some version of it, became only the responsibility of the state, the giant state that would make sure that the poor are treated well, that it is the poor who benefit from the state's redistribution of resources, from the state's solicitude, as if a state can have care for someone. That's a dubious proposition. But if we don't want the state to do it, we should look for other organizations that are capable of expertise, of trying to help those who most need help, of trying to reach out to the poor, to in some way develop a personal relationship with those who need that most. The medium of the organization, with its bureaucracies, its expertise, its division of labor, its ability to spread itself and tie itself around the world is unique in modern society, close to unique. The Catholic Church would have that. Some of the parts of the Catholic Church would have that. Some charitable organizations might have that. But corporations are a great modern accomplishment that, because they have this depth to them, this multifaceted nature, they can do great good. And if they don't do it, that just leaves the space open for the collectivist state to do more. So I would say, if only for self-defense against socialism or communism of its worst sort, we should focus on the corporation as a vehicle for solidarity with the poor, with the poorest. And that way, they become a weapon against exclusion, against unjust inequality. And instead of becoming part of an economy which kills, they become part of the economy which vivifies. Now, how do you do that? And there's a bit I wanted to contribute here to the supply of practical advice, but I won't be hugely practical, but I'll try and do a little bit of that. Is the first thing, if you're an executive or an owner of a company, there's a process. Well, let me say, I have 2 commands and 3 observations. The first command is to think about how the poor can be helped, both inside and outside, both within and outside of the course of normal business. So there's a kind of discernment, to use a good Catholic word, of what's going on, to look at these people. Because remember, the first thing about the poor is that they're probably out of sight. They're excluded. They're excluded from your thought. They may be in your thought as workers or as neighbors or as customers, but they may not be in your thought as poor people in need of help. Or they may just not be in your thought at all. You may not have noticed them. You've contracted out the production of this product to some place in the third world, and their workers are not your problem, you think. So they're just not even in your sight at all. But as you say when you go to confession, or when you say the Confiteor, we're sins of omission and of commission and of omission, of the things I've done and the things I have failed to do. The poor people, the excluded ones, are almost by definition ones you got to think about, the things that I didn't do that should have done, the people I should be thinking of but am not. So a discernment is necessary to find these poor people who just probably won't be, as they say, on your radar. If they were, they'd probably be less poor and less in need of help. Or as I say, they may be in some other aspect of their personhood on your radar, but not in thinking about them as possibly poor people. And I want to also remind you of something that both Francis and Benedict before him have made the point very strongly, and Mother Teresa, who's come up a couple of times and should always come up in any conversation about economics, is in the West, we don't have a lot of material poverty. We have some. There are people who, in rich countries like the United States, actually go hungry, actually are cold. But there's very little of this kind of extreme absolute poverty in these countries. But what we do have is a vast amount of spiritual poverty. The spiritual emptiness of our culture is a tremendous, tremendous poverty. People are excluded from the richness of the kingdom of God that is offered to them in this world by the church, but even by, the truth that subsists in all religions, the great goodness of the world. Many people feel are alienated from that. And so when thinking about reaching out for the excluded, the poor in the West, one has to a little bit twist the words and perhaps the direct intention of Pope Francis and think, who are the people who are being impoverished by my business or who are not being enriched by my business, who could be? Who are these people who are excluded, for whom I should have a preference in thinking about how I do business? So the first part of this discernment of the poor is to identify them, to find them. And then I should think about not just the people I work with or the people that I sell to, but what am I doing? What products am I selling? What services am I making? Am I doing something that is in itself an exclusionary thing? Am I trying to to make my customers feel proud or make the people who can't afford my product be jealous? Am I trying to in some way insinuate and impoverish materially some people by the things that I do in my business, by the way that I do my job? We heard yesterday a brilliant account of how gambling is not a good business for the soul. And it's the point that what a surprise. The people who run gambling organizations have criminal tendencies. That's brilliant, really. The more I think about it, the more profound that is that the business you are in both reflects your weaknesses and strengths, we hope, but certainly your weaknesses, and amplifies them. And so it's important to think of those poor people. Are some of them being made poorer by what I do in my business life, in my business, the very business? So first, discernment. Second, favoring them. How can I make my solidarity? By reaching out to the poor, by showing them that fraternal charity that we heard about this morning. That makes them, is the shining example, the shining activist, making active of solidarity. And how do you do that? Well, that's, again, a question of discernment. But it can be very, very straightforward things. In fact, it often is a very straightforward thing. For example, I mean, I don't know, having talked to most of the people here, I don't think very many of you actually have a lot of business in poor countries. In my journalism world, I frequently work with companies that are very large. And one of the things that people will tell me is, it's good to be what it used to be known as a paternalistic employer. We provide education, housing, social services, because in many poor countries, that's an enormous advantage. There was a big fight about platinum mining in South Africa, and it turns out that one of the issues there is that the companies no longer provide housing for the miners who live very far from their families. And it would be perfectly affordable for them not just to provide housing, but to actually bring the families in to live with the miners. But it never occurred to these mining companies that that was something they should do. So we pay them a fair wage. They're paid twice as much as typical workers, or 4 times as much. It's true a few of them die every year, but that's life expectancy is short in South Africa anyway. And it was all a bit, I mean, they really didn't mean any harm. It was a sin of omission. It was something they hadn't thought about. And for them, a way of reaching out to the poor would be to create, to support communities among the miners, their workers. That's just an example. In rich countries, as I say, there are poor people for whom one might think about trying to find. There are people who may be unable to find the basic things of life and who are too dependent on the state. The great tradition, say, of hiring handicapped people, mentally or physically handicapped people, because you wish to reach out to these excluded, to these poor people. But again, I would argue that the best thing, probably for most companies or most firms in the West and developed countries, it is the spiritual poverty you should worry about, and to favor them is often to is to really rethink pretty strongly some pretty hard things that we don't tend to do. Are we promoting the spiritual welfare of our workers, of our customers? Are we trying to encourage them to be greedy, or are we trying to encourage them to be reasonable, to be moderate, to be thoughtful about their consumption? And I want to say that it's very easy to find justifications for what we do. I'm slightly involved I live in London, and I'm slightly involved in an initiative of the Archdiocese of Westminster in London, which is to try and help businesses be better, sort of more moral. And it's actually a rather competitive field. There are about 6 different organizations trying to help businesses be more moral, which I find rather comical. You know, if it was so easy, why are there so many people trying to do it? And if it's so hard, why don't we all get together? But no, of course, we're all fighting. It's human nature at its worst. So, no, we're more moral than you are. No, we're, whatever. And I was talking to someone who had worked for Unilever, the large consumer goods company, and she was talking about how they had a moral issue she had a moral issue with one of their big products, which was Lynx, the deodorant spray, which is, I don't think she had a problem with the product, but she had a problem with the advertising, which is entirely based on seduction. So what happens is you put this stuff on, and girls, for men, and the girls fall at your feet, and it's all, I mean, it does not promote an elevated view of the human person and his sexual nature, shall we say. And she said, you know, from any kind of moral perspective, this is an impoverishing thing. You are helping your customers have a very poor view of what they're supposed to be doing in life. It is to show solidarity with the poor. In the case of this company, in this product, you should change your advertising. And the people at Unilever are actually aware of this issue in a general sort of way, because they developed they developed an advertising campaign for their women's products showing regular women, not models, to suggest that, because they felt that the way that models were shown to advertise face cream or whatever was demeaning was impoverishing the concept of women as beautiful, and so they showed women who were large or you know, slightly, you know, whatever, not perfect, wearing their products, and they were widely recorded. But Lynx is way too profitable, and there was a line that was drawn. You couldn't really start, you know, doing that with Lynx, because you would just ruin the brand if you just said, well, this makes you you don't smell so bad when you wear it, so why don't you wear it? So there was this problem there, and I think that this kind of how do you favor the poor? Well, sometimes you have to make pretty hard choices, and you wish that people would do this, would help you with it, and I'll come to that in a second. So the first command is to think about the poor that can be helped and then help them. The second command is to try to enlarge the corporate community. No company is an island. They all exist in an industry. They have customers, they have suppliers, they have regulators, governments that they work with. They have an environment that, you know, the physical environment that they have to be concerned with, pollution of all sorts. They have a community in which they are set. They have neighbors. They have schools. This is a whole thing. And this goes back to my point about how the definition of a corporation as a sort of walled-in thing is way too narrow, walled-in profit-seeking monster. That's that paperclip eating thing that we heard about yesterday. It's a terrible idea of how a company is supposed to be. A sort of economic man writ large, 4,000 economic men brought together to make one giant economic creature that just tries to get larger and larger. No. But in fact, what you should think of is that you are part of a community of corporations, and as such, you should try to work together to help support the poor. If all the deodorant makers and body spray makers would agree not to have such demeaning advertising, it would be much easier for the people at Unilever to do this. It's hard. And there might be some upstart that will come in, and there are all sorts of issues of economics, of competition and freedom. But the basic idea seems to me to be very true. A few years ago, the American food companies came close to saying that we should make nutrition a shared industry goal and try and get away from this. And there was going to be a sort of compact, and then some of the companies backed out, partly, again, for legal reasons, but partly for commercial reasons, that there are a lot of very profitable, not very nutritious products out there. And, but that was a good idea, and that was helping a kind of showing, if you'd done that, that would have shown a solidarity with the poor. But it's a means to do that is to enlarge your corporate community. Now, I want to then have three observations, which I will go through reasonably quickly. The first one is that the firm itself is a community, and part of your obligation of solidarity with the poor is to look for the poor within your firm, to try and make the firm a spiritually enriching place to be. But also the fact that the firm is a community limits what any one person can do. You can be the 100% owner of the shareholders' equity, the chief executive, the chairman of the board, and domineering personality who no one wants to say no to. You still can't make the firm do the things you want. I was talking to someone here and sort of say, well, if what we want to do is campaign against, I think that our firm should take a stance on some moral issue, some issue perhaps not of solidarity with the poor, I can't do it, even though I own the place, because, or I'm the biggest shareholder and run it, because I have coworkers, I have neighbors, I have to be in some way in community with them, and they won't stand for it. I won't be able to recruit new workers. I won't be able to deal with my customers. If they hear I'm just one of those Catholic fanatic companies, I'm going to be very limited. I have a lot of sympathy for that. It's not easy. I'll come to that in a second, that it's this not easy point, because that's my third observation. But my second observation is an amplification, and it's more relevant to publicly quoted companies than to private companies. It's an amplification of my point about the nature of the company. Shareholders are frequently your enemies. The public shareholders, the equity investors, have a lot of trouble being committed to virtue. This isn't necessarily true, it just happens to be true. It's not in the nature of being a shareholder that you have to be this way. If we were virtuous, if our society were good, if Adam hadn't eaten that damn apple, shareholders would be right on board with the virtue project. But in practice, they are not. And having worked for 25 or so years in the public stock markets, I can say they don't even, I mean, you're not even talking their language. You're talking Japanese to people who speak only English. To say what you should be interested in is solidarity with the poor is just really hard for them. They're short term, they're interested in the stock price, not the company. When they're interested in the company, they're only interested in the profit line. When they're interested in the profit line, they're only interested in it in the very short term. So if you say the whole world will be better, we're much less likely to have a nuclear war if my company does well, and so actually this cost and short-term profits is over the 400-year horizon that we should be thinking about really good for you, they just say, look, I've got a quarterly report to make. If your stock price isn't up in 2 months, I'm sunk. You're not really talking the language. But you should recognize this. And when one has enemies, one should try to make friends with them. One should try to bring them around. But the first thing to realize is they're not on your side. When someone's not on your side, you have to deal with them in a different way than when they're on your side. When they're on your side, you say, whatever you want is probably for my good, I should please you. When you think they're not on your side, you have to think, how can I trick you, persuade you, cajole you, make an ultimatum to you to make sure that my vocation to solidarity with the poor is being fulfilled. I'm living out that vocation to the best I can. And so you must think of the shareholder as your enemy. So the first observation is no firm is an island, which both gives you something to think about and limits what you can do. The second is that shareholders are your enemy, or at least not your friend, not on your side. And the third is I'm calling for very hard things to do. I mean, the example that I gave you of Lynx is pretty hard. You know, it's one of the most profitable products in a very large company. To come out and say, okay, we're not going to do that because we think it's the wrong thing to do. You know, you're going to have those shareholder enemies all over you. And your customers, your retailers are going to say, what are you doing? You're crazy. I remember a beer company that was pointed out that the 11% alcohol beer they were making was drunk by only one group of people, which were alcoholics. It was vile, undrinkable. It was the cheapest thing you could do. And it was used in a toxic combination in Scotland with something else that caused, hospital emergency rooms were filled with people who were drinking this stuff. And someone eventually got to the point of saying, what you are doing is making alcoholism a worse problem in this country because you're making it easier for alcoholics to get drunk faster. And they stopped making the product. And they said, the guy that was doing it said, one day I woke up and I realized I could not go to sleep at night thinking what I am doing all day is selling a product that makes the world worse, unquestionably worse. And he rejected the argument that, what if I don't do it, someone else will? He said, I don't care about that. I just can't do it. But it's hard. It was a stream of profits. It was a good business in the sense of it made money. The retailers liked it, at least the kind of retailers that don't mind drunks wandering into their stores and taking their last pennies out to buy this stuff. So it was hard. But the thing is, and this is my closing thought, and this is the basic teaching of ethics from Aristotle through Pope Francis, is if being good were easy, more people would do it. We want to be good. We have a natural inclination to the good, but we find it difficult. And that's just as true in corporate life. It's just as true for firms and for the people who run the firms and the people who work in them as it is in our personal lives. If being good were easy, more people would do it. We are called to do hard things. And solidarity with the poor in the society that we live in the corporate world that we have created, is a hard thing. Our corporations are not designed for that. Many of the people involved in the corporations don't like it. So I'm asking you to think, I want to do a hard thing. I want to show this solidarity with the poor. But like all good things, to be good, to be virtuous, to develop the habits of virtue, as we heard yesterday, the rewards are even greater than the difficulty.